Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's both strange and amusing: medieval nobility and their, let's say, questionable fashion choices. If you think high fashion today is a bit over the top, just wait until you step into the wardrobe of a 12th century noble. They had a whole different idea of style, and trust me, it's not what you might expect. From robes that weighed more than your entire body to hats that would make you question your life choices, medieval fashion was a wild ride. You might not even survive your first day wearing some of these outfits. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, don't forget to drop a comment with the city you're tuning in from and the time there. I'm genuinely curious where in the world you're listening to tonight's story. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The nobility of the medieval period didn't just wear clothes, they made a statement. Dressing was not about warmth or comfort. It was about displaying power, class, and identity. Imagine this. If you were walking down the street, dressed in the most fashionable outfit, people would immediately look at you and wonder, are you a noble, a merchant, or just a peasant trying to get by? For the nobles, clothes were all about flaunting their status, grabbing attention, and making sure everyone knew who they were and what they stood for. If you lived back then, chances are you'd be wearing one of those heavy robes that weighed more than your entire body. These garments weren't just for protection against the cold, they were designed to turn heads. The layers, the embellishments, and the intricate designs were more about making an impression than about practicality. Historians still debate why medieval nobility was so obsessed with wearing clothes that were not just impractical, but sometimes downright ridiculous. It's not unlike today's fashion trends. There were cycles and fads. But some of the choices back then were so over the top, they make today's high fashion seem pretty tame. For instance, have you ever seen one of those ridiculous, oversized hats made of gold silk? Yes, those hats, which looked like something out of a mad party, were part of what was considered high fashion at the time. But why did these nobles wear such elaborate clothing? It wasn't just about showing off their personal style. It was about power and influence. The richer you were, the more intricate and heavy your clothes. It wasn't about comfort. It was about communicating to everyone around you that you were above them. And let's face it, if you were one of those nobles walking through the market, you'd be hard to miss, what with your shining jewelry, your thick velvet robes, and your ridiculous feathered hat. You might be thinking, these nobles must have been self-absorbed, right? Well, in a way, yes, but in their time, appearance was everything. If you didn't dress correctly, you weren't just out of style, you were socially irrelevant. A single fashion misstep could exclude you from elite circles forever. Today, the fashion world argues over what's in and out. Back then, the most important question was whether or not your clothes communicated your status properly. As you walk through the streets of a medieval city, imagine the overwhelming sight of nobles clad in layers upon layers of fabric. You'd think they were preparing for a royal ball, but no, this was simply their daily attire. Now don't get me wrong, these robes weren't the light, breathable kind we see in modern fashion. Oh no, these were heavy, cumbersome garments that were more likely to make you sweat than keep you cool. Yet this was the fashion of the time, a way of showing off wealth, status, and power, even at the cost of comfort. So why did these garments have to be so heavy? The idea was simple. If you were a noble, you had to stand out. And nothing says, I have power, quite like a robe that could probably double as a tent. These robes often reached the floor and were designed to drag behind you with an air of importance. The longer the robe, the more dignified you appeared. The term dragging your feet wasn't just about laziness, it was a sign of your wealth. The more you could afford to cover your body in intricate cloth, the more respect you commanded from others. But here's the thing. This grand fashion wasn't about keeping you comfortable in the least. These garments, for all their beauty, were anything but practical. They were restrictive, awkward, and often impractical for the average person. You wouldn't want to try running from a fight in one of these. And yet, the nobility wore them with pride, as if the weight of their robes was a symbol of the weight of their responsibility. Who needs practicality when your clothes scream, I'm the boss? Historians are still debating the reasons behind this obsession with heavy attire. Some argue it was about the power of the visible weight, in a society where physical appearance was paramount. Others suggest that it was a subtle way to mark out the nobility from the peasants. After all, if a peasant wore a robe like that, they'd never be able to work in the fields. But one thing's for sure, comfort was definitely not a priority in the medieval wardrobe. To fit in, you had to suffer for fashion. Now, isn't that something to think about the next time you complain about tight jeans? This obsession with heavy clothing extended beyond just robes. Hats, for example, were another crucial part of the medieval noble's outfit. You've probably seen the tall, pointed hats depicted in medieval paintings or films. These hats weren't just quirky fashion statements. They were often so tall that they could be a safety hazard. Imagine walking through a crowded market with a hat taller than your head. People would get out of your way, not out of respect, but because you were quite literally in their face. These towering hats were often decorated with feathers, jewels, and bright fabrics, making them the crown jewels of the medieval wardrobe. Yet despite their grandeur, these hats were absurdly impractical. But then again, in medieval society, who needed practicality when you could show off with a hat that made a statement? In a world where personal worth was constantly being measured by outward appearances, these hats weren't just about fashion, they were about asserting dominance. They were your personal billboard to the world, saying, I am here and I am to be respected. Historians still argue about the exact purpose of these extravagant hats. Some believe they symbolized the wearer's wealth and social position. Others think they were a form of medieval power play, meant to intimidate or set apart the wearer from the common folk. Either way, these hats were a big deal. But one thing is certain, if you ever found yourself in the presence of a noble wearing one, you'd probably be too distracted by the sheer size of it to even pay attention to anything else. Now, let's talk about color, because honestly, medieval nobility didn't just wear bright colors because they liked them. Oh no, colors in the Middle Ages were far more significant than that. They were status symbols, markers of wealth and power. And not just any colors. These nobles were drawn to the most eye-popping, extravagant shades that you could imagine. One of the most popular colors? Purple. purple wasn't just any color, it was reserved for royalty and the highest classes of society. Why? Well, the dye used to make that vibrant shade of purple came from a rare mollusk found in the Mediterranean, and getting that dye was no easy task. It took thousands of mollusks to produce just a small amount of purple dye, making it incredibly expensive. In fact, purple became so closely associated with royalty that in many medieval societies, the wearing of purple was strictly regulated. Only the most powerful could afford to drape themselves in this regal color. Imagine walking around in a sea of deep purples, like you were constantly reminding everyone, yeah, I'm the top dog here. It must have felt a bit like wearing a walking crown, don't you think? But not everyone was lucky enough to get their hands on such expensive dyes, so the rest of the nobility had to make do with more affordable, though still incredibly flashy colors. Bright reds, greens, and blues were the next best thing. But here's the thing. Even these colors came with their own set of rules and implications. If you wore red, for example, it could mean that you were wealthy, but also that you were trying a bit too hard to stand out. It was a color that said, look at me, but perhaps not in the most graceful way. The rich reds used by nobility were often created from expensive dyes made from plants and insects, and those dyes were even more costly than purple in some cases. Red wasn't a color you wore if you wanted to be subtle. It was the look at me color of the medieval world. Historians still debate whether these colorful choices were purely about status, or whether they also had a deeper social or religious meaning. Some believe that the colors were meant to represent the virtues of the wearer. Purple, of course, was linked to royalty and power, while red could symbolize strength and courage. Blue, often worn by clergy, was associated with the Virgin Mary and spiritual purity. Then, of course, there's green, which was often linked with youth and prosperity. So the nobles weren't just wearing these colors to look good. They were sending messages with every shade they wore. But let's be honest for a second. Did the nobles really understand the full meaning of their color choices? Or were they just following the latest trends, as we do today? Historians still debate whether color in the Middle Ages had a deeper symbolic meaning beyond status and class, or if it was simply about being fashionable. What we do know is that the nobles sure knew how to make an impression with their wardrobe. It was all about standing out, about being seen and remembered. And in a world where your worth was often tied to your appearance, these color choices were one of the easiest ways to communicate who you were without saying a word. Of course, some of these color choices could have backfired. For example, if you wore too much red or purple, people might start to get suspicious. Maybe you were trying to claim a higher social position than you deserved. And don't even get started on what happened if you wore these colors and were seen by someone in a higher class. The risk of being looked down upon, or worse, shunned, was very real. But that didn't stop the nobles. They were willing to take that risk for the sake of fashion, because what was wealth and power without a little drama? Now, let's move on to something that might just make you laugh. Hats. Oh yes, hats were absolutely essential to the medieval noble look, and they weren't the casual accessories we wear today. No, these hats were not only a statement piece, they were sometimes downright absurd. You've probably seen those towering, pointy hats in medieval art or movies. Well, those hats weren't just for decoration. They were a symbol of status, as bizarre as that might sound. These hats, often called chaperones, were designed to be not just eye-catching, but utterly impractical. They were tall, pointed, and often covered in extravagant decorations like feathers, jewels, and brocade. And get this, they weren't even designed to be easy to wear. The larger and more absurd the hat, the more you had to be careful about it falling off in the wind. But that's exactly what made them desirable. The nobility would wear these outlandish hats to communicate their status and wealth, but also their ability to endure the discomfort that came with them. Imagine walking around town with a hat taller than your head, perhaps swaying in the breeze or scraping against doorways. How's that for style? You'd be drawing attention from everyone in the square, but not necessarily in a good way. In fact, I'd bet that half the reason these hats were so popular was because they made a grand entrance, or exit depending on how many times the wearer knocked them off with their own awkward movements. Historians still argue about the exact reasons for these towering hats. Some say they were symbols of authority, marking the wearers as important figures within the community. Others suggest they were simply a fashion trend that spread among the wealthy, like the oversized flamboyant hats seen on runways today. The more practical explanation is that they were just an extreme way to show off, because in the world of medieval nobility, if you couldn't stand out with your clothing, were you even considered important? Yet these hats weren't just about making a statement. They also represented power and authority. Much like a crown or a tiara, the larger and more elaborate the hat, the more it signaled your place in society. But let's be honest here, what kind of a power symbol is it really when you're walking around in a hat that could give someone a black eye if you accidentally bumped into them? Maybe these hats were more about creating a memorable image rather than being truly practical. In a world where appearance was everything, this was just another way to let everyone know that you had arrived and you were there to stay, even if your hat made everyone laugh behind your back. What's even more interesting is that not just anyone could wear these hats. Wearing a hat like that was a privilege reserved for those with real wealth. And it wasn't just any hat that would do. The materials had to be exquisite: fine silks, rich velvets, and lavish trims. But here's the kicker. The hat had to be worn in the right way. If you didn't know the proper way to tilt it or adjust it, you could easily end up looking like a fool. It wasn't enough to own a fancy hat. You had to wear it with finesse, or else you were just another noble who couldn't get their fashion game together. Historians and fashion experts still debate why medieval nobles were so obsessed with these impractical, towering hats. Was it just about showing off wealth, or was there something more to it? Were these hats really an expression of identity, or were they simply a ridiculous trend that everyone jumped on because, well, that's what everyone was doing? As with much of medieval fashion, it's hard to say for sure. But one thing is certain. These hats were part of a larger social game, a way to prove that you had the power to stand out, even if it meant looking a little foolish. As we continue this journey through the wild and wacky world of medieval fashion, let's move on to another, shall we say, unique aspect of nobility's wardrobe: shoes. Now you might be thinking, what's so strange about shoes? They're just shoes, right? Oh, my friend, if only it were that simple. Medieval footwear was anything but ordinary. In fact, it was downright bizarre and, dare I say, impractical to a fault. Medieval noblemen and women often wore shoes that would put today's fashion to shame. Imagine shoes that had long, pointed toes, so exaggerated that they looked more like something from a fairy tale than actual footwear. These shoes, called poulains, were all the rage in medieval Europe, especially during the 14th and 15th centuries. The toes of these shoes could stretch to absurd lengths, sometimes even reaching past the knee. And what's the point of such a ridiculous design? Well, you guessed it, status and style. The longer the toe, the more fashionable you were. Think of it like the medieval version of wearing the most outlandish pair of shoes today, just for the sake of being noticed. The poulains were the kind of shoes you wore when you wanted to say, "Look at me. I have enough wealth and time to wear shoes that make walking a challenge. Oh, and did I mention these shoes weren't exactly practical? Picture trying to walk, let alone run, in shoes that were longer than your legs." In a world that valued practicality, these shoes were an absolute contradiction. But in the world of the medieval nobility, that's exactly what fashion was all about, making sure you stood out, even if it meant a little inconvenience along the way. Interestingly, while these long, pointy shoes were a huge trend among the nobles, they also became a bit of a status symbol. The wealthier you were, the longer your shoes could be. Some records even suggest that some nobles had to shorten their shoes as a way of proving that they weren't too rich, in an attempt to avoid looking too ostentatious. The longer the shoe, the more you were signaling to society that you had so much wealth, you didn't even care if you could walk comfortably. Now, historians are still debating whether these shoes were more about style or status. Was it truly a fashion choice, or was it just a way for nobles to flaunt their wealth? Whatever the case, one thing is for sure. These shoes weren't about practicality. The poulains weren't the only strange shoes of the time either. In fact, many of the medieval nobles wore shoes made from incredibly expensive materials, like velvet and fur, making them as much about showing off wealth as they were about comfort. Some were even decorated with precious stones, making them look less like footwear and more like walking jewelry. Imagine walking into a room with shoes that sparkled under the light, like you were a walking treasure chest. But as with the rest of medieval fashion, these shoes weren't made for comfort. The nobles who wore them might have been rich, but they certainly weren't putting their feet first. And let's not forget the noblewomen. Their shoes were no less extravagant, though perhaps a bit more functional, or at least they tried to be. Noblewomen's shoes often featured high heels. Yes, high heels, long before they became fashionable in modern times. These shoes, though, weren't about looking sleek or refined. They were designed to show that the wearer was so high class that even her shoes had to be elevated, both literally and figuratively. Historians still debate how practical these high heels were in everyday life, but one thing is certain: these shoes were just another piece of the extravagant puzzle that made up medieval nobility's sense of style. In the end, it's hard to look at medieval fashion, especially the shoes, and not laugh. Sure, the nobles of the time were trying to communicate wealth and status, but it's hard to ignore the fact that they were also willing to wear shoes that made walking difficult or downright dangerous. Maybe they were onto something. We just never thought to wear uncomfortable shoes to show off our wealth today. But hey, if nothing else, at least the poulins were unforgettable. Moving on from shoes, let's talk about something that's bound to make you chuckle: the accessories. Now, we're not talking about a subtle necklace or a sleek belt. Oh no, in medieval times, accessories were on an entirely different level. Nobles decked themselves out in massive, over-the-top accessories that would make today's fashion runways look tame in comparison. They weren't just wearing simple jewelry, they were adorning themselves in elaborate, eye-catching pieces that often seemed to have no practical purpose other than to announce, "Look at me, I am wealthy, and I can afford to wear this." Let's start with the humble belt. You might think of a belt as something to hold up your pants, right? Well, in the medieval world, belts were so much more than just functional. These were extravagant pieces, often adorned with precious metals, gemstones, and intricate embroidery. They weren't just holding up your tunic, they were making a statement. Some of these belts were so richly decorated that they could rival any royal crown in terms of their opulence. And, like the other garments of the time, they served a very clear purpose: to show off wealth. The more ornate the belt, the more status it conferred upon its wearer. But belts weren't the only accessories that medieval nobles wore to make themselves stand out. How about a giant, oversized brooch pinned right in the middle of your chest? That's right, brooches. Huge, flashy brooches were a key part of the medieval nobility's wardrobe. These weren't small, subtle pieces of jewelry. These were large, shiny, attention-grabbing ornaments that sat proudly on the chest of whoever wore them. They were often set with jewels, making them even more attention-grabbing. You could probably spot a noble from a mile away just by the glint of their oversized brooch. And the bigger, the better. It was all about making sure no one could possibly miss you. And let's not forget about the chains. Oh yes, chains, often thick, heavy, and laden with large pendants. Nobles would wear them around their necks as another status symbol. These chains weren't delicate gold chains like what you might find today. These were massive, chunky affairs designed to be noticed. You weren't just wearing a chain, you were wearing a statement. It was like wearing a billboard around your neck that screamed, "I have so much money, I can wear this just for fun." The longer, thicker, and more adorned the chain, the more it screamed wealth, authority, and power. But here's the funny part. For all their extravagance, these accessories weren't necessarily the most practical. Can you imagine wearing a thick, heavy chain or a massive brooch all day? And yet, for the medieval nobility, it was worth it. These accessories were more than just decoration. They were a way of showing off, a way of making sure that everyone around them knew just how powerful they were. And don't even get me started on the gloves. Gloves in medieval times weren't just for warmth. Oh no, these gloves were another fashion statement. Nobles would wear gloves made of fine leather, velvet, or silk, and they were often decorated with intricate stitching or jewels. A good pair of gloves was as important as any other accessory, and they often matched the overall outfit perfectly. Some nobles even had gloves that were long enough to cover their entire arms, turning their hands into yet another canvas for wealth and status to be displayed. Historians still debate the purpose of all these accessories. Was it just about flaunting wealth, or was there a deeper, more symbolic meaning behind them? Some suggest that accessories, like the brooches or chains, had deeper meanings tied to family heritage, religion, or political power. Others argue that they were simply part of the aristocratic culture of excess. Either way, it's clear that medieval fashion wasn't just about dressing for comfort or utility, it was about dressing for status. The more elaborate your accessories, the higher you ranked in the social hierarchy. So, next time you see someone wearing an oversized piece of jewelry, just remember they're probably channeling their inner medieval noble, trying to make sure the world knows just how much they've got. Whether it's a massive belt, a shiny brooch, or a chain thick enough to anchor a ship, these accessories weren't just about looking good, they were about making an unforgettable statement. Now that we've talked about the more eye-catching parts of medieval nobility's wardrobe, let's shift focus to something that might be a little more practical, or at least we like to think so: the materials. You might assume that medieval clothing was just made from wool and leather, but in reality, the materials used were often luxurious, costly, and downright bizarre. So buckle up as we explore some of the more unusual and extravagant fabrics that nobles were draping themselves in. First off, let's talk about silk. Oh yes, silk. The rich and powerful loved to wear silk because it was the ultimate status symbol. Silk was rare, expensive, and imported from far-off places like China, which meant that only the wealthiest nobles could afford it. If you were fortunate enough to wear silk, you weren't just showing off your wealth, you were also showcasing your connections. Silk was so highly coveted that the mere presence of it in your wardrobe was enough to make everyone around you take notice. You were basically saying, I can afford the finest materials, and I have access to the global trade network. Not bad for a piece of clothing, right? But here's the kicker. The nobility didn't just settle for any old silk. Oh no, they had to have the finest, most luxurious silks available. They often chose silks that were richly dyed and embroidered, sometimes with gold or silver thread, making their outfits even more eye-catching. If you think about it, wearing silk back then was like wearing a designer suit today, except instead of showing off your wealth with a logo, you were showing it off with luxurious fabric that practically screamed, I'm important. Then, of course, there's velvet. Velvet, like silk, was a fabric that only the nobility could afford. It was soft, plush, and had a richness to it that made even the simplest of garments look like a work of art. Velvet was a favorite for outer garments and accessories, but you didn't just throw on a velvet cloak and call it a day. Oh no, velvet was meant to be adorned with intricate patterns and designs that highlighted the wealth of the wearer. For the medieval nobility, wearing velvet was a way of saying, not only am I rich, but I have taste and style too. The soft sheen of velvet could catch the light in such a way that it added an air of nobility and prestige to any outfit. Today, you might find velvet used for evening wear or theater costumes, but back then, it was reserved for those who could truly afford to indulge in such luxury. But let's not forget about furs. Yes, furs were another favorite of medieval nobility, especially in the colder regions. The fur of animals like ermine, mink, and squirrel were prized possessions that adorned the cloaks, sleeves, and even the hoods of the nobility. Furs weren't just practical, They were another way to show off wealth and power. After all, hunting these animals and acquiring their pelts wasn't an easy task. It took resources, land, and of course, access to a certain social circle. The wealthier the noble, the rarer the furs they wore, and as with silk and velvet, the more luxurious the fur, the higher your social standing was perceived to be. Now let's pause for a second to think about all of this. Silk, velvet, furs. These materials were more than just clothing. They were tools for social signaling, for showing off. But was it practical? Absolutely not. These materials, while beautiful and expensive, weren't exactly built for function. Silk, for example, doesn't exactly keep you warm in a cold medieval winter, and velvet can be a bit heavy and impractical for everyday use. Yet these weren't clothes you wore to survive. They were clothes you wore to thrive, to communicate that you were someone of power and importance. Historians still debate the exact role these materials played in society. Some believe that the materials were meant to reflect the wearer's proximity to power, like how silk and velvet were often reserved for the king or queen, and how fur was a symbol of status in colder climates. Others argue that the materials were less about status and more about the growing cultural importance of fashion in medieval courts. No matter the reason, one thing is clear. The materials used by medieval nobility were as extravagant as their behavior. They were symbols of opulence and excess, and they left a mark on the cultural fabric of the time that we can still see echoes of today. So the next time you're complaining about the price of designer fabrics or the hassle of shopping for luxury goods, just remember, medieval nobility had to contend with a whole other level of fabric envy. Their wardrobes were less about utility and more about telling the world, I'm not just anyone, I'm someone you need to notice. All right, now that we've covered the extravagant materials and the excessive accessories, let's dive into something a little more personal. How these medieval nobles actually wore all of this stuff. It's one thing to have a wardrobe filled with extravagant garments, but it's another to actually get dressed in them. And let me tell you, dressing up as a medieval noble was no small feat. In fact, it was a laborious process that required more time and effort than most of us spend on getting ready for a night out today. First, let's talk about layers. Oh yes, layers upon layers were key to any noble's outfit. You didn't just throw on a tunic and call it a day. No. Nobles wore multiple layers of clothing, each designed to add to the overall look and signal different things about their status. The first layer was often an undergarment made of linen, followed by a tunic or gown, then a cloak, and maybe a fur-lined cape if you were feeling extra fancy. And don't forget the accessories. Belts, chains, rings, and brooches were strategically placed to make sure no part of the outfit went unnoticed. Getting dressed was a ritual in and of itself. Servants would help nobles with the layering process, carefully adjusting each piece to make sure it fit just right. If you were a noblewoman, you'd probably need assistance with that long, heavy gown, especially if it was designed to drag on the ground. For a nobleman, the attention to detail in arranging each layer of fabric was just as crucial. Getting every piece just right wasn't just about vanity, it was a matter of respect and hierarchy. If your clothes were arranged improperly or looked untidy, it could reflect badly on your status, and in a society so focused on appearances, That was a big deal. But here's where it gets even more ridiculous. The layers didn't just serve to make you look rich, they were designed to give off a certain silhouette. That's right. The fashion back then was all about creating the perfect look. Some noblemen wore padded doublets to create a broad, muscular chest, while noble women would wear undergarments to make their waist appear tiny and their chest fuller. The goal was to accentuate certain features and suppress others, almost like putting on a costume that didn't just cover your body but shaped it into the ideal form. Then, of course, there were the shoes. As we've discussed before, these were no ordinary footwear. Medieval shoes were often pointy, impractical, and designed to stand out. But the process of getting these shoes on wasn't as simple as sliding your feet in. Many times, they were fastened with straps, which required assistance from your servants. Can you imagine having to wait for someone to help you get your shoes on every day? It's like preparing for a fashion show, but without the luxury of simply slipping into your favorite pair of sneakers. Now let's talk about the final touch, the hats. Remember those absurd, towering hats we've talked about? Well, putting those on was no small task either. You couldn't just throw them on and be done with it. These hats were heavy, often decorated with large feathers or jewels, and needed to be carefully adjusted to make sure they stayed in place. Wearing a hat like that meant you had to hold your head high, literally, and be very careful not to knock it off as you went about your day. Getting that perfect look took time, effort, and a lot of self-assurance. After all, you had to walk around with a hat taller than most people's ceilings. Historians are still debating whether all this effort was worth it. On one hand, these extravagant outfits were meant to show off wealth and power. On the other hand, they must have been a nightmare to wear. With the layers, the accessories, the shoes, and the towering hats, it's hard to imagine how these nobles got anything done in their daily lives. It's almost as if they were dressing for a special occasion every single day. Was it about practicality? Absolutely not. But was it about making a statement? You bet it was. In the medieval world, fashion wasn't just about looking good. It was about asserting your place in society, making sure everyone around you knew who was boss. So next time you're running late because you can't decide what to wear, just remember, at least you don't have to rely on servants to help you get dressed in an outfit that took hours to assemble. The next time you complain about getting your shoes on, just picture a pair of pointy poulins and a towering feathered hat to complete your ensemble. You'll probably feel a little better about your outfit. Trust me. Now that we've seen how much effort went into putting on an outfit, let's talk about the ultimate purpose of all these wild and extravagant fashion choices: status. Medieval nobility didn't just dress up to look good, they dressed to show everyone who was in charge. Every part of their wardrobe, from their towering hats to their sparkling jewelry, was a visual cue signaling wealth, power, and influence. It's safe to say that in medieval society, appearance was everything. The way you dressed wasn't just a reflection of your taste, it was a reflection of your social position. Imagine this. You're walking through a town square, and you see a nobleman dressed head to toe in velvet, with gold jewelry sparkling in the sunlight. His long, pointed shoes are nearly as tall as his head, and the feathered hat on top of his head looks like it could take flight at any moment. What do you think? You don't need to know his name to know that he's important, and that's exactly the point. Medieval nobles used their clothing to immediately distinguish themselves from everyone else. It wasn't about subtlety, it was about visibility. The idea was to wear enough grandeur to ensure that anyone who saw you knew exactly what your social rank was. The more opulent your attire, the more you were regarded as a person of high standing. And that's why you'd see nobles wearing the most ridiculous outfits. They wanted to be seen, and they wanted everyone to know that they were worth seeing. In a world where social hierarchy defined every interaction, what you wore could literally shape your identity. Let's break it down a little more. We've already covered how noblemen dressed in silk, velvet, and fur. These were not just for warmth, they were luxurious materials that showed off a noble's access to the most expensive and exotic resources available. But it wasn't just about the materials, it was also about the quantity. The more layers you wore, the more fabric you draped yourself in, the more wealth you were signaling. There's an almost absurd level of vanity in the way these nobles dressed, but in a society that valued hierarchy above all else, it was necessary. In fact, not dressing in a way that demonstrated your social position could be seen as an insult, or worse, an attempt to be mistaken for someone of a lower class. And the importance of this fashion game didn't stop at the garments themselves. The accessories, like the massive brooches, chains, and rings, served as further status markers. Each accessory was a sign of your wealth and influence. The larger the ring or the shinier the brooch, the more likely it was that you were connected to the highest echelons of society. It wasn't enough to just wear fine clothes. You had to adorn yourself with everything that could shout, "I am important." But it wasn't just about being flashy for the sake of it. There were also very real consequences if you failed to dress appropriately. If you were a noble and you didn't meet the fashion standards of the time, it could hurt your reputation. You'd risk being seen as out of touch, or worse, as someone trying to fake their status. For nobles who lived in courts, where competition for power was fierce, dressing the part could literally make or break your standing. It's interesting, though, that historians still debate whether this obsession with dress was purely about showing off, or whether there was a deeper cultural significance behind these fashion choices. Some believe it was about the performance of power, dressing to communicate one's authority, and ensuring that no one could mistake you for anything less than what you were, a person of influence. Others argue that this extravagant dress was part of a cultural and religious desire to display piety or devotion. Perhaps it was a way of demonstrating that you were worthy of your high position, that you were blessed with wealth and power by a higher force. Whatever the exact reasoning, one thing is clear. Medieval fashion was about more than just looking good. It was about crafting an image of yourself that commanded respect and admiration. But let's be real for a second. Could it have all been just a bit too much? I mean, we're talking about wearing outfits so heavy and impractical that they might slow you down in a chase, or wearing hats so tall that you'd need to duck every time you entered a room. It makes you wonder, did the nobles ever look at their wardrobes and think, this is a little ridiculous? Or were they just too wrapped up in the social game to care about comfort? Historians still don't have all the answers, but one thing is for sure. These outfits weren't about functionality, they were about performance. The nobility were all about putting on a show, and their fashion was their stage. As we dive deeper into the fashion world of medieval nobility, let's take a step back and think about the real impact these flamboyant outfits had on the rest of society. The extravagance of their dress wasn't just for the amusement of the nobles themselves, it sent powerful messages across social classes. In a world where social mobility was limited, the clothes you wore could make or break your chances of moving up the social ladder, or worse, keeping you in your place. Now imagine you're a commoner in the medieval period. You've worked in the fields all day, your hands are calloused from labor, and your clothes are made of rough, inexpensive wool. But then, as you're walking through town, you catch sight of a nobleman strolling by. His robe is made of the finest velvet, trimmed with gold thread, and his shoes are so pointy that they could puncture the heavens. His cape is lined with fur, and there's not a hair out of place. His entire look screams wealth, power, and a complete disconnection from your reality. What does that say to you? Well, it tells you that this person is beyond your reach, a member of the upper class that you'll never be able to join. The nobility's lavish fashion wasn't just about impressing other nobles, it was a clear demarcation of where you stood in society. It was a physical manifestation of the divide between the elite and the common folk. In a time when there were few ways to escape the rigid social structure, fashion provided a constant reminder of your place in the world. But here's the real kicker. It wasn't just the commoners who had to observe these flashy displays of wealth. The nobility themselves were constantly under scrutiny. Yes, even they were caught up in a fierce competition to outdo each other with their outfits. Wearing the most extravagant clothes was a way of claiming superiority over rival nobles. The goal wasn't just to be fashionable, it was to be more fashionable than the next guy or the next lady. And the competition wasn't just about looking good, it was about showing everyone that you had more money, more influence, and more power than anyone else. Of course, there were risks to this sort of fashion competition. For one, nobles had to worry about their outfits being too extravagant, too ostentatious. If you were too flashy, it could make you a target of ridicule, or worse, it could make you a target of envy. Other nobles might start plotting against you, hoping to bring you down a peg. It wasn't uncommon for someone in the upper class to be brought low simply by their excessive displays of wealth. A fine line had to be walked between being fashionable enough to show your status and being so over the top that you invited unwanted attention. Historians are still unsure whether the nobility's obsession with fashion was as much about competition as it was about maintaining power. Was it truly about showing the world who was in charge? Or was it more about surviving within a system where power was constantly in flux? Some suggest that medieval nobles used their clothing as a form of protection. By wearing the most ostentatious and extravagant outfits, they were signaling to others that they were too powerful to be toppled. Others argue that this constant battle for fashion supremacy was just one more layer of the complex and often brutal politics of the medieval court. But let's be honest, how sustainable was this lifestyle? Could anyone really keep up with the constant pressure to outdo one another? These nobles were caught in a never ending cycle of wealth and fashion, driven by the need to maintain their social position. It's almost like a medieval version of today's social media culture, where everyone is trying to one up each other with the most outrageous outfits, extravagant displays, and impressive lifestyles. But back then, instead of likes and followers, you had to rely on your fashion choices to communicate your status to the people around you. In a way, medieval fashion wasn't just about looking good, it was about survival. Your clothes were your armor in the political battlefield. If you were dressed correctly, you were part of the elite. If you weren't, you might as well have been invisible. And that's a pretty harsh reality, don't you think? All of a sudden, your worth as a human being depended on your ability to wear the right clothes at the right time, to be seen and recognized, to be acknowledged as important in a world that often valued appearances above everything else. But when you think about it, isn't that a bit like today's world too? We may not have to wear silk and velvet to prove our worth, but we certainly put a lot of stock into how we present ourselves. Whether it's the latest trends, the most polished Instagram photos, or the perfect designer outfit, we still find ourselves competing for attention, for status, and for validation. The medieval nobility, in all their extravagant glory, may have been onto something. But perhaps what they really proved is that fashion has always been and will always be a way to communicate far more than just personal style. It's about signaling who you are, what you stand for, and where you fit into the grand scheme of things. And let's face it, sometimes that's all we really want: to be seen, to be noticed, to matter. So let's take a step back from the grandeur of medieval fashion and look at something a little more practical: the cost. Now, we've already established that medieval nobility was all about excess, whether it was in their materials, their layers, or their accessories. But one thing that often gets overlooked is just how expensive it was to maintain such an extravagant wardrobe. And no, I'm not just talking about buying a few tunics here and there. I mean the real cost, the kind that could bankrupt a family if they weren't careful. Let's talk about silk for a second. If you were a medieval noble and you wanted to dress in silk, you were paying an exorbitant amount for it. Remember, silk wasn't made locally. It had to be imported from far-off places like China. And to get even a small amount of silk, you had to have serious connections and deep pockets. Some records suggest that a single yard of high-quality silk could cost as much as an entire year's worth of wages for an average worker. So when a noble would drape themselves in yards of silk, they were literally wearing an entire year's income, and that's just for one outfit. But silk wasn't the only costly fabric. Velvet, fur, and even the most basic wool, all of these materials were expensive in their own right. Velvet, for instance, was often reserved for the highest ranks of nobility because of its softness and its labor-intensive production process. To make velvet, you needed the finest materials and highly skilled artisans to craft it into the lush fabric we know today. If you were walking around in velvet, you weren't just showing off your style, you were broadcasting your wealth in a way that everyone could understand. And then there are the accessories. We've talked about the gold brooches, the chunky chains, and the lavish rings that medieval nobles loved to wear. But do you know how much these cost? Gold was a precious commodity in medieval Europe, and crafting intricate jewelry out of it required not only the finest artisans, but also an immense amount of wealth. Some nobles had entire collections of gold jewelry, each piece more elaborate than the last. The more intricate the design, the more expensive it became. Imagine needing to buy a new outfit for every major event, each with its own set of gold chains, rings, and brooches. You could easily be looking at the equivalent of several years' worth of a commoner's wages just to afford one ensemble. But let's not forget the shoes. Oh yes, the shoes. Those long, pointy poulains we talked about earlier. As ridiculous as they might seem today, back then, they were a symbol of status. The longer and more pointed your shoes were, the more you had to pay to have them made. These weren't just any shoes. They were crafted from expensive leather, often decorated with precious metals or jewels. And because they were such a prominent part of the noble wardrobe, you had to have multiple pairs to rotate through. After all, you couldn't wear the same pair of shoes to every event, could you? No, that would be far too common. Now think about this. Every noble family had to not only maintain their own wardrobes, but they also had to maintain the wardrobes of their servants and household staff. It wasn't just about looking good for the public eye. It was about keeping up appearances within the household as well. If you were a noble, you needed to ensure that your entire household was dressed in a way that reflected your status. That meant hiring skilled tailors, seamstresses, and jewelers to craft the finest garments and accessories, not just for yourself, but for everyone in your service. And what happens when you can't afford to keep up with these extravagant expenses? Well, that's when the financial strain hits. Some noble families found themselves deeply in debt, borrowing from the wealthy merchant class or even the monarchy itself, just to keep up with the constant demand for new clothes and jewelry. If you couldn't maintain the appearance of wealth, you risk losing your position in society, or worse, your title. It was a brutal cycle. In order to stay relevant and keep your status intact, you had to keep spending, even if it meant sinking into debt. Historians still argue whether this constant cycle of spending was a product of medieval nobility's obsession with fashion, or whether it was simply a survival mechanism in a world where appearances were everything. Some believe that it was about power, being able to afford such extravagant clothing and accessories was a way of showing dominance over others. Others suggest it was a way to display one's loyalty to the monarchy or the church. But one thing is certain, the financial cost of medieval fashion was astronomical, and not every noble could keep up. So next time you look at your closet full of clothes and think about how expensive your shopping habits are, just remember, at least you don't have to worry about your wardrobe bankrupting you. Medieval nobles had to constantly balance their desire for luxury with the very real financial pressures of keeping up appearances. It's like a never-ending game of who can spend the most without losing everything. And let me tell you, that's a game that wasn't always kind to its players. As we move further down the path of medieval fashion, let's take a moment to consider something that might surprise you: the very real consequences of these fashion choices. Sure, you might think of the nobles as sitting comfortably in their elaborate robes, flashy jewelry, and towering hats. But what about the times when their outfits didn't just make them stand out, they got them into serious trouble. One of the most common consequences of wearing the wrong outfit was offending someone who was of a higher rank. Remember, medieval society was rigidly structured. There were strict rules about what each class could and could not wear. And if you were a noble trying to look more important than your peers, it could come back to bite you. The issue was this: clothing wasn't just about fashion, it was about politics. And if you wore something that was considered too flashy, you could be seen as flaunting your wealth in a way that made other nobles uncomfortable. For example, wearing too much gold or fur could make others see you as showing off, especially if it was done at the wrong time or in the wrong place. It was one thing to wear expensive clothes at a royal feast or a public ceremony, but doing so at a local gathering or while interacting with the common folk was seen as inappropriate. The nobles understood this, of course. They were walking a fine line between impressing their peers and maintaining a sense of decorum that wouldn't alienate the people they needed for their own political standing. If you were a noble and you didn't manage your fashion choices carefully, you might find yourself being publicly humiliated. The concept of face was a big deal in medieval society, much like it is today in some cultures. If you lost your face by looking too extravagant or too poor, your social standing could quickly plummet. You might not lose your title outright, but your reputation could be severely damaged. And in a world where reputation was everything, that was just as bad as being stripped of your title. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Fashion also had an impact on the way nobles were viewed by the common folk. While commoners couldn't afford to dress like their noble counterparts, they certainly noticed when a noble wore something outrageous or overly elaborate. And believe me, the common folk had no problem commenting on the behavior of those in power. A noble dressed too lavishly in front of peasants could be seen as cruel or out of touch with the struggles of the lower class. They were walking a fine line between being the face of luxury and becoming a target for public ridicule. It's also worth mentioning the religious context of medieval fashion. Yes, religion had a massive influence on what was deemed appropriate to wear. The church wasn't just the center of spiritual life, it was also a center of political power. And if you were a noble who flaunted your wealth through your clothing too much, the church could step in and remind you of your moral obligations. In some cases, the church even issued decrees on what was and wasn't acceptable to wear. For example, during certain periods, the church forbade the wearing of overly extravagant garments, deeming them sinful or wasteful. This didn't just apply to the common folk, it applied to the nobility as well. Imagine being a noble who spent all your wealth on a fancy new wardrobe, only to have the church declare that you've sinned by dressing too luxuriously. The consequences were both social and spiritual, and that was a very big deal. Of course, not all nobles played it safe when it came to fashion. Some saw their clothes as a way to take bold risks, to assert themselves as leaders, and to push against the boundaries of what was acceptable. These risk-takers, however, often found themselves at odds with both their peers and religious authorities. But then again, in a society as rigid as medieval Europe, maybe that was the point. Dressing outrageously was one way to be remembered, even if it meant a little controversy. Historians still debate just how far the nobility pushed these fashion boundaries. Some argue that the nobility intentionally sought to provoke and differentiate themselves from the common folk, while others believe that they were simply doing what was necessary to keep up with a competitive court culture. But one thing is clear: the social and political consequences of medieval fashion weren't to be taken lightly. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about maintaining power, social standing, and even personal safety. And as ridiculous as some of those outfits may seem today, in the medieval period, they were much more than just clothes. They were tools of survival in a world where appearances were everything. So when you look at your closet today and think, this is too much, remember, it could always be worse. At least you're not at risk of losing your social standing, your title, or your reputation just because of a questionable fashion choice. Medieval nobles, on the other hand, had to be careful that their style didn't turn them into a target. Now, let's turn the page on another aspect of medieval fashion that's just as fascinating: the influence of international trade on nobility's wardrobes. You might be thinking, what does trade have to do with fashion? Well, my friend, quite a lot, actually. Medieval Europe was at times a hub of international trade, and just like today, when goods travel across borders, so does fashion. The trade routes of the medieval world didn't just bring spices, silks, and exotic goods. They also brought new fashion ideas, colors, and materials that would have an impact on the nobility's wardrobe. Take the famous Silk Road, for instance. This was a series of trade routes that connected Europe to Asia, stretching all the way from China to the Mediterranean. Through these routes, Europe gained access to rare and luxurious materials, mostly like silk, porcelain, and spices. But perhaps the most important import was the silk itself. If you were a noble in medieval Europe, you probably couldn't get enough of this fine fabric. It was highly prized and imported at great expense. The nobility of the time would import silk from Asia, use it for their robes, and flaunt it as a symbol of their wealth and connections to the faraway East. But it wasn't just silk that was making its way to Europe. The nobility also had a keen eye for exotic materials and fashion trends from the Islamic world, Africa, and the Far East. For instance, the luxurious fabrics from the Islamic world, richly patterned textiles, and finely woven materials made their way into the courts of European nobility. And it wasn't just about the fabric itself. The very style of clothing and the way it was put together were influenced by the garments worn by people in the Islamic empires, where clothing was often loose, flowing, and designed with comfort in mind. European nobles began to adopt these influences, and soon their clothing was a mix of local styles and exotic touches from faraway lands. These international influences didn't stop with textiles. There were also new colors, patterns, and accessories making their way across borders. For example, the deep indigo dyes that were produced in the Islamic world became highly sought after in Europe. The rich blue hue became synonymous with luxury, and nobles would wear robes dyed with these exotic colors to show off their wealth and connections to the wider world. And let's not forget about the jewelry and accessories that were also making their way from these far-off places. Precious stones from India, gold from Africa, and pearls from the Persian Gulf were all imported to Europe and quickly found their way into the wardrobes of the wealthy. The nobles loved adorning themselves with these exotic gems, and the more rare and beautiful the stone, the better. This was yet another way to show off both their wealth and their cosmopolitan connections. But this influx of foreign fashion wasn't just about showing off wealth. It also symbolized the growing power of European monarchs and the rise of a more interconnected world. As trade routes opened up and Europe became more engaged with the rest of the world, nobility could express their power not only by accumulating vast wealth, but by demonstrating their global connections through their clothing. Wearing imported silk or adorning themselves with jewels from the East didn't just say, "I'm rich." It also said, "I'm connected to the world, and I'm part of something much bigger than just my local realm." Of course, this didn't come without its complications. As more exotic goods flowed into Europe, the cost of maintaining such lavish wardrobes increased. Not only did the nobles have to contend with the expense of the materials themselves, but they also had to rely on skilled artisans to turn these exotic goods into wearable fashion. The pressure to keep up with the latest trends, whether they were silk from the Far East or gold from Africa, could create financial strain for some noble families. And just like today, fashion cycles could become quickly outdated. Nobles had to stay ahead of the game, constantly updating their wardrobes to reflect the newest imports and trends. It was a delicate balance between maintaining the prestige that came with wearing exotic clothing and not bankrupting yourself in the process. Historians debate just how much international trade influenced medieval fashion. Some argue that the impact was minimal, with local styles dominating the wardrobe of most nobles. Others suggest that the influx of foreign goods and styles had a profound effect, shaping the fashion choices of the time. The truth, of course, is likely somewhere in between. The nobility was influenced by foreign fashions, but at the same time, they retained their local identities through traditional styles and materials. However, one thing is clear: medieval nobility's clothing wasn't just a reflection of their local culture, it was a reflection of their growing engagement with the world beyond their borders. Today, when we look at fashion, it's hard to imagine a time when it was so deeply tied to international trade and global connections. In medieval times, your outfit could say a lot about where you came from, where you could go, and the connections you had with the wider world. So the next time you wear that imported fabric or piece of jewelry, remember, you're not just indulging in modern trends. You're participating in a long tradition of global fashion that started all the way back in the medieval period. At this point, you might be wondering, did medieval fashion ever change? Surely, with all this emphasis on extravagance, excess, and international influence, there must have been some point where it all came crashing down, right? Well, you're not entirely wrong. Fashion, even in medieval times, was subject to change, albeit more slowly than what we're used to today. But the evolution of style in the Middle Ages wasn't just about trends. It was about politics, warfare, and the shifting nature of society itself. One of the major turning points came with the Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century. The disease, which killed millions, had far-reaching effects on every aspect of medieval life, including fashion. With the massive death toll, the economy was thrown into chaos, and the old system of aristocratic opulence began to falter. Suddenly, There was less money to go around, and many noble families couldn't afford to indulge in the luxurious clothes and accessories they had grown accustomed to. As a result, fashion became less about the excessive display of wealth and more about practicality. It's interesting to note that in the aftermath of the Black Death, the nobility began to shift toward more practical and subdued styles. For instance, elaborate robes made of silk and velvet were replaced by simpler woolen garments, and the extravagant layers that had defined medieval fashion were trimmed down. The ornate jewelry that once symbolized status was replaced with simpler, more modest pieces. In a way, the Black Death forced fashion to evolve, not just because of financial constraints, but because of a deeper cultural shift. The values of the time began to change, and nobles who had once flaunted their wealth with flamboyant clothing now had to adopt a more restrained style. But this wasn't just a trend that affected the aristocracy, it had a trickle-down effect on the rest of society as well. As more commoners began to wear clothing similar to that of the nobility, the gap between the two classes started to close. Fashion was no longer a clear delineation between the elite and the working class. The growing availability of textiles, particularly wool, meant that the once extravagant clothing of the nobility was becoming more accessible to the lower classes. This democratization of fashion meant that nobility couldn't rely on their clothing to maintain the same level of status it once had. And with this shift, the foundations of medieval fashion began to crumble. Another significant moment came with the rise of the Renaissance, which marked the end of the medieval period and the dawn of a new era in art, culture, and yes, fashion. As Italy became the heart of Renaissance culture, fashion once again became a vehicle for personal expression, but this time, the nobility's wardrobe was defined by a desire for sophistication and artistic excellence rather than the mere display of wealth. Clothing in the Renaissance was characterized by intricate tailoring, new materials, and a focus on form and proportion, qualities that were often overshadowed by the sheer excess of medieval style. The Renaissance saw a shift away from the excessive ornamentation of the Middle Ages toward a more refined, polished aesthetic. The change in fashion wasn't just about the fabrics and the cuts of the clothes, it was symbolic of a broader cultural shift. The medieval obsession with hierarchy, power, and excess gave way to a more individualistic culture that celebrated humanism, the beauty of the human form, and intellectual achievement. This shift was reflected in the clothing that the nobility wore, which became more focused on artistic craftsmanship than the overt display of power that had defined medieval fashion. At this point, you might be wondering, did medieval fashion ever change? Surely, with all this emphasis on extravagance, excess, and international influence, there must have been some point where it all came crashing down, right? Well, you're not entirely wrong. Fashion, even in medieval times, was subject to change, albeit more slowly than what we're used to today. But the evolution of style in the Middle Ages wasn't just about trends, it was about politics, warfare, and the shifting nature of society itself. One of the major turning points came with the Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century. The disease, which killed millions, had far-reaching effects on every aspect of medieval life, including fashion. With the massive death toll, the economy was thrown into chaos, and the old system of aristocratic opulence began to falter. Suddenly, there was less money to go around, and many noble families couldn't afford to indulge in the luxurious clothes and accessories they had grown accustomed to. As a result, fashion became less about the excessive display of wealth and more about practicality. It's interesting to note that in the aftermath of the Black Death, the nobility began to shift toward more practical and subdued styles. For instance, elaborate robes made of silk and velvet were replaced by simpler woolen garments, and the extravagant layers that had defined medieval fashion were trimmed down. The ornate jewelry that once symbolized status was replaced with simpler, more modest pieces. In a way, the Black Death forced fashion to evolve, not just because of financial constraints, but because of a deeper cultural shift. The values of the time began to change, and nobles who had once flaunted their wealth with flamboyant clothing now had to adopt a more restrained style. But this wasn't just a trend that affected the aristocracy, it had a trickle-down effect on the rest of society as well. As more commoners began to wear clothing similar to that of the nobility, the gap between the two classes started to close. Fashion was no longer a clear delineation between the elite and the working class. The growing availability of textiles, particularly wool, meant that the once extravagant clothing of the nobility was becoming more accessible to the lower classes. This democratization of fashion meant that nobility couldn't rely on their clothing to maintain the same level of status it once had. And with this shift, the foundations of medieval fashion began to crumble. Another significant moment came with the rise of the Renaissance, which marked the end of the medieval period and the dawn of a new era in art, culture, and yes, fashion. As Italy became the heart of Renaissance culture, fashion once again became a vehicle for personal expression. But this time, the nobility's wardrobe was defined by a desire for sophistication and artistic excellence rather than the mere display of wealth. Clothing in the Renaissance was characterized by intricate tailoring, new materials, and a focus on form and proportion, qualities that were often overshadowed by the sheer excess of medieval style. The Renaissance saw a shift away from the excessive ornamentation of the Middle Ages toward a more refined, polished aesthetic. The change in fashion wasn't just about the fabrics and the cuts of the clothes. It was symbolic of a broader cultural shift. The medieval obsession with hierarchy, power, and excess gave way to a more individualistic culture that celebrated humanism, the beauty of the human form, and intellectual achievement. This shift was reflected in the clothing that the nobility wore, which became more focused on artistic craftsmanship than the overt display of power that had defined medieval fashion. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, the social and political structures that had once made opulent clothing so necessary began to fade. The feudal system, which had been propped up by the visual representation of nobility's superiority, was slowly replaced by more modern forms of governance and power. And as this happened, fashion too evolved into something less about the obvious visual representation of power and more about the subtleties of taste and sophistication. Historians still debate whether the fall of medieval fashion was a result of economic shifts, political changes, or the rise of new cultural values. But one thing is clear: the end of the medieval period marked the beginning of a new era for fashion. The clothes may have been less extravagant, but they were no less important. Fashion was still a way of expressing wealth, status, and personality, but it was done in a way that was more nuanced and sophisticated than the gaudy displays of the medieval nobility. So when you think about the end of medieval fashion, think about how it mirrored the end of an era defined by excess, hierarchy, and the outward expression of power. Fashion, like society itself, was evolving, and the medieval period's flamboyant, power driven wardrobes were replaced by the refined intellectual and artistic styles of the Renaissance. And in many ways, the evolution of fashion marks the shift from the old world into the new. And now, we reach the final chapter of our journey through medieval fashion. As we wrap up this exploration, it's important to take a moment to reflect on how the clothing choices of medieval nobility shaped not just the society of the time, but also how we understand history today. You see, fashion was far more than a means of covering the body. For the medieval nobility, it was a lens through which we can still examine power, social dynamics, and cultural shifts that happened centuries ago. The most striking thing about medieval fashion is how it was so intricately tied to status. The materials, colors, and cuts of their garments weren't just about looking good, they were designed to convey information. To dress like a noble was to announce, I belong here in this world of wealth and privilege. But to not dress like a noble, that was a direct signal of your lower status, something that would brand you in the eyes of others. Clothing in the medieval period was an armor of sorts, one that protected the nobility from being seen as common, while also ensuring they were identified as part of the upper echelon. But here's the thing. While we can admire the artistry, the sheer detail, and the elaborate layers that went into these garments, it's impossible to ignore how uncomfortable and impractical many of them were. Those towering hats, long pointed shoes, and heavy draped robes, none of it was designed for comfort. And let's not forget the hours spent getting dressed, the weight of the fabrics, the attention to detail, all just to send a message that would last as long as one's appearance did. The fact that nobles were willing to endure all that discomfort simply to maintain their social standing speaks volumes about how deep the obsession with status ran. Now let's talk about how all of this affected the common folk. In the medieval world, fashion wasn't just a way for nobles to stand out. It also solidified the divide between the upper and lower classes. When you look at the clothing of the peasants, you see a stark contrast to that of the nobility. Where the nobles had fine silks, rich furs, and elaborate adornments, the common people were limited to simpler, more practical garments made from wool or hemp. This disparity in clothing wasn't just about the quality of materials, it was a visual representation of society's structure. Nobles wore their clothes as armor, while commoners wore theirs to survive. And yet, as we saw during times like the Black Death, even the nobility wasn't immune to change. The economy, the political landscape, and social upheavals all had a hand in shaping how people dressed. When the plague hit, the ostentatious displays of wealth started to fade as survival became the priority. In fact, this was the start of a shift in how fashion was perceived in medieval Europe. No longer was it just about flaunting power and wealth. It began to reflect practicality and the desire for something simpler, more functional. The long lasting influence of these shifts in fashion can be seen in the rise of the Renaissance, a time when clothes were still rich with meaning, but where sophistication and intellectualism began to take precedence over pure spectacle. As the nobility moved away from the overt extravagance of the medieval period, they began to focus more on craftsmanship, fit, and subtlety. The Renaissance brought forth a new way of dressing, one that emphasized personal identity and an appreciation for art and beauty, setting the stage for modern fashion. So, how does all of this tie together in the grand scheme of history? The fashion choices of medieval nobility weren't just about what they wore, they were about power, identity, and how society viewed itself. They used clothing as a tool to express who they were, what they stood for, and where they fit in the social order. Whether it was the extravagant robes, the lavish jewelry, or the towering hats, these fashion choices played a pivotal role in the shaping of European society. In many ways, medieval fashion tells the story of a time when status was everything and when a person's outward appearance could dictate their future. Now, as we reflect on the bizarre, opulent, and often uncomfortable fashion choices of the medieval nobility, we can't help but smile. It's easy to laugh at how ridiculous some of their outfits seem today, but they were part of a system that valued appearance above all else. And in the end, that's what makes medieval fashion such a fascinating topic. It's not just about the clothes, it's about what they represented. In their outlandishness, they give us insight into the hearts and minds of the people who wore them. And with that, we close the chapter on medieval fashion. While we might never fully understand the obsession with towering hats or pointy shoes, we can certainly appreciate the role fashion played in defining an era. So the next time you find yourself staring into your closet, wondering if your outfit is too much, just remember, at least you don't have to worry about being judged for the size of your hat. And with that, we bid farewell to the world of medieval nobility and their quirky, extravagant wardrobes.